The northern Nevada desert was a place of isolation, its barren landscape stretching endlessly, an ocean of sand and jagged rock broken only by the occasional scraggly brush. It was unforgiving, hostile to life, and most who found themselves there had no intention of staying long. But there was one man who had called it home for over 20 years. To the few who knew him, he was simply the Hermit. His name was Elijah Hawkins, though no one had spoken it aloud in years. He lived in a ramshackle wooden shack, nestled between craggy hills where the wind howled like a tortured soul. The shack was little more than a few sheets of rusted metal and rotting wood cobbled together, but it was all Elijah needed. The town of Gerlach, miles to the south, sometimes spoke of him in whispers and legends. Most of the locals claimed to have seen him once or twice when he came into town for supplies, always keeping to himself, always looking haunted. He never stayed long, just enough to buy canned food, water, and kerosene. Then, he'd disappear back into the desert, swallowed by the horizon. People in town had their suspicions. Some said Elijah had come to the desert to escape the law. Others believed he'd lost his mind after a personal tragedy and had retreated from society. There were darker rumors, too, whispers about people disappearing near the hills where Elijah lived, stories of odd sounds carried on the wind at night. None dared go out that way, not after dark. Elijah sat at the edge of his shack, staring into the dying sunset. The desert stretched out before him, a sea of orange and red, broken by jagged hills and the shadow of the mountains in the distance. His eyes, sharp and blue, scanned the horizon, as if waiting for something. The truth was, Elijah wasn't hiding from anyone, he was hiding from himself. He could feel the darkness inside him, a festering wound that had been growing since the day he left civilization. It whispered to him in the night, urging him to do unspeakable things. And over time, he had stopped resisting. It had been years since Elijah killed his first victim. A drifter, lost in the desert, had stumbled upon his shack one summer night. The man had been desperate for water, his face cracked and blistered from the heat. Elijah had given him water, of course. He had welcomed the stranger inside, listened to his story. The drifter never left. There was something about the man's desperation, his weakness, that stirred something dark inside Elijah. By the time he realized what he was going to do, it was already too late. The knife was in his hand, and the drifter's blood was pooling on the dusty floor of the shack. It had been easy, so easy that it scared him. But it also thrilled him in a way he couldn't explain. The years had passed, and the killings had continued, always spaced apart, always with travelers who had no one waiting for them. Elijah had become skilled at choosing his victims, ensuring they wouldn't be missed. He knew the desert well, knew how to make bodies disappear, and the vast emptiness of the northern Nevada desert provided him all the cover he needed. But it wasn't enough. The darkness that lived inside him had grown, and now it demanded more than the occasional drifter. Elijah began to dream of blood, of the feel of flesh yielding beneath his hands. He would wake in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, his pulse racing, the need gnawing at him like a wild animal. One night, a storm rolled in from the west. It was rare for rain to fall in the desert, but when it did, it came in violent torrents, accompanied by booming thunder and sharp flashes of lightning. Elijah sat inside his shack, the wind battering the flimsy walls as he stared into the fire that crackled in the small stove. His mind was elsewhere, lost in the memories of his past. He had tried to be a good man once. Before he became the hermit, Elijah had lived a life of normalcy. He had a wife, a small home in Reno, and dreams of starting a family. But everything had changed when his wife had died, killed in a car accident that wasn't anyone's fault but fate's. That was when the darkness had first entered him, creeping into the corners of his mind like a shadow he couldn't shake. He had tried to live with it, but over time, it consumed him. He left Reno, left everything behind, and found solace in the desert. Or so he thought. But the darkness had followed him, and now it was his only companion. As the storm raged outside, Elijah heard something, faint at first, but growing louder. A voice. He stood, his heart quickening. No one came out here, especially not in a storm like this. He grabbed the old rifle that leaned against the wall and stepped outside into the pouring rain. The wind whipped against his face as he scanned the darkness. There, in the distance, a figure was stumbling toward him, their silhouette barely visible against the jagged landscape. It was a woman, drenched from head to toe, her clothes clinging to her body as she staggered forward. Elijah's grip on the rifle tightened as she approached. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear and desperation, just like the drifters so many years ago. "Please," she gasped, collapsing at his feet. "Help me." For a moment, Elijah hesitated. The woman was young, maybe in her 20s, and clearly terrified. The rational part of his mind told him to help her, to bring her inside and let her dry off by the fire. But the darkness, the thing that had consumed him long ago, had other plans. Inside the shack, the woman sat shivering by the fire, her teeth chattering as Elijah handed her a blanket. She thanked him, her voice small and fragile, like a child's. She told him her name was Sarah, that she had been traveling with friends when they got separated during the storm. Elijah nodded, pretending to listen. His mind was already elsewhere. He could feel the familiar stirring inside him, the need growing stronger with every passing second. He tried to suppress it, to push it down, but it was useless. Sarah continued to talk, oblivious to the danger she was in. She spoke of her friends, of the camping trip they had planned, of how she had gotten lost. But Elijah wasn't listening. All he could think about was the knife tucked into his boot, and how easily it would slide into her flesh. The storm outside had grown even fiercer, the wind howling like a pack of wild animals. The sound drowned out Sarah's voice, making it seem distant, almost otherworldly. Elijah stood, his hand slipping toward the knife, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, something strange happened. Sarah stopped talking and looked up at him, her wide eyes locking onto his. For the first time since she had arrived, she seemed to notice the danger. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Instead, her eyes widened in terror as she saw the glint of the blade in Elijah's hand. In that moment, something shifted inside Elijah. The darkness that had controlled him for so long suddenly recoiled, as if sensing something even more sinister in the air. He froze, the knife trembling in his grip, as a cold chill ran down his spine. And then he heard it, a low growl, barely audible over the storm, coming from the corner of the shack. Elijah turned slowly, his eyes searching the shadows. But there was nothing there. The growl came again, louder this time, and closer. Elijah's breath caught in his throat as the shadows seemed to shift and move, forming a shape, a figure that loomed over him, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Before Elijah could react, the figure lunged. Pain exploded in his chest as sharp claws tore into his flesh. He screamed, dropping the knife as he stumbled back, his vision blurring. The last thing he saw before everything went black was Sarah's face, twisted into a cruel, satisfied smile. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the desert eerily silent. The shack was empty, the door hanging open, swaying gently in the breeze. Inside, the fire had long since died, leaving only cold ashes behind. Of Elijah, there was no sign, except for the bloodstains on the floor and the strange, claw-like marks gouged into the walls. The townspeople in Gerlach would whisper about the hermit for years to come, telling tales of his mysterious disappearance and the strange woman who had last been seen with him. Some said she had been an avenging spirit, sent to punish Elijah for his sins. Others believed she was something far darker, something that had been lurking in the desert long before Elijah ever arrived. But no one ever ventured near the shack again. And no one ever found Elijah Hawkins.